my name is Ruby Sauceda Hernandez. I'm from Rio Grande, Zacatecas. Let's study together the memory verse found in the book of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 33. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. God bless you.
Throughout this week we have explored one of the most profound and challenging themes in the book of Joshua, the relationship between war and worship, between obedience and the divine presence. Israel was in the middle of a military campaign, but instead of focusing only on strategy or strength, Joshua led the people to stop, raise altars, celebrate the Passover, write the law, and renew the covenant. It was a lesson in spiritual priorities. Before conquering territory, the heart had to be conquered. The central message of this lesson teaches us that loyalty to God is not demonstrated only in moments of peace, but also and especially in the midst of battle. In the most intense days of Israel's story, when threats were real and danger constant, the people learned that true strength is not found in the number of soldiers, but in the presence of God. When worship comes first, victory becomes a natural consequence of faithfulness. The lesson Supreme Loyalty, Worship in the Midst of War, reminds us that serving God does not mean avoiding battles, but facing them from the altar. Where humanity sees conflict, God seeks communion. Where the world raises swords, the believer raises worship. Welcome. My name is Augusto Palacios, and this is Studying the Lesson. Friday, November 14th. Supreme Loyalty, Worship in the Midst of War Review. On Sunday in the Covenant First, we saw Joshua halt the military advance to renew the commitment to God on Mount Ebal. While enemy nations were preparing to attack, Israel gathered to worship. This act of faith revealed the true priority of the people, not to advance without first ensuring that the Lord was still leading. Raising an altar in the middle of war was a declaration of total dependence. It was as if they were saying, our safety is not in walls, but in God's faithfulness. In a society that glorifies hurry and self-sufficiency, Joshua teaches us that worship is always the first victory strategy. On Monday with the Passover, we remembered that before lifting the sword, Israel had to remember the blood of the Lamb. The Passover celebrated at Gilgal marked the beginning of life in the Promised Land. It was a sacred pause in which the people acknowledged that their story did not begin with conquest, but with redemption. That meal was not just another ritual, it was a proclamation of the gospel and symbols, the slain lamb who gives meaning to freedom. Without that remembrance, every victory becomes empty. Passover teaches us that the believer does not fight in order to obtain salvation, but because he has already been saved. Worship precedes action, because only those who have experienced grace can fight with purpose. On Tuesday, under the theme Altars of Renewal, we saw that the altars were more than structures of stone, they were meeting points with God. At those altars, the people sealed their loyalty and reconsecrated their obedience. On Mount Ebal, Joshua wrote the words of the law on stones, fulfilling Moses' instruction. That altar was not a war trophy, but a spiritual monument. There, Israel acknowledged that its success depended on its faithfulness. In times of triumph, the altar reminded them that all glory belongs to God. In times of defeat, the altar reminded them that there is still hope as long as worship exists. On Wednesday, in Written in Stone, we understood the value of permanence. God commanded that the law be written on stone because he knew the human heart forgets easily. Every word engraved was a guarantee of continuity. Future generations would read and remember. While the nations carved the names of their kings, Israel carved the name and will of its God. That difference was essential. The empires of antiquity left behind ruins, the people of God left behind testimony. Today, that lesson challenges us to have lives as firm as stone, where the law of Christ's love is written not on monuments, but on the heart. On Thursday, in longing for His presence, we discovered the spiritual core of the entire lesson. Without the presence of God, war, law, and altar lose their meaning. Joshua understood what Moses had already said, "If your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here." Book of Exodus chapter 33 verse 15. There was no victory without communion, no inheritance without divine company. The glory of the Lord was Israel's true treasure. That principle still stands. Temples, plans, and works may be impressive, but if the presence of God does not dwell in the midst of His people, everything becomes empty noise. Authentic worship is born from a deep desire to have God near, not only on the lips but in the soul. The common thread of the entire week is loyalty as a form of worship. Not a superficial loyalty, but a total commitment that includes obedience, remembrance, and dependence. Israel was not faithful because it was afraid of losing the war, but because it understood that the covenant was life. Faithfulness was not an administrative requirement, but an act of love. To worship in the midst of war meant remembering that God is not absent in conflict. He uses conflict to reveal His glory. Every altar, every stone, and every ceremony pointed to the same message: God is still at the center of history. This lesson also confronts us with a personal challenge. In our own daily wars, inner struggles, family challenges, spiritual trials, we tend to act first and pray later. Israel teaches us the opposite. Victory is born at the altar, not from human effort. Worshipping in the middle of the battle is not escaping reality, but acknowledging that power belongs to the Lord. Worship is the breathing of the believing soul, the force that turns chaos into calm. Finally, this entire narrative points to Christ, the true Joshua. Just as Joshua led the people into the promised land through obedience and covenant, Christ leads us into eternal salvation through His sacrifice. In Him, the Passover, the law, and the presence all come to fulfillment. His cross is the final altar, His blood the seal of the covenant, and His Spirit the abiding presence. He is the perfect revelation of supreme loyalty and the ultimate object of all worship. To worship in the midst of war is to live with the certainty that God is present even in the most intense moments. Israel understood this when it stopped its march to raise altars, write the law, and celebrate the Passover. We learn it every time that, in the midst of struggle, we choose to kneel before we advance. Supreme loyalty is not proven by words, but by the ability to stop and seek God when everything around us demands that we run. The book of Joshua leaves us with an eternal lesson. Worship is not an escape from conflict, but the force that carries us through it. God does not always change the circumstances, but He changes the worshiper. And when the heart surrenders to the Lord, war ceases to be a field of fear and becomes a stage for faith. That is why the lesson concludes with a simple and profound truth. Worship in the midst of war is not only an act of faithfulness, it is victory itself. Because the God who dwells among His people does not abandon the battle, He fights it with them. And in His presence, every war is transformed into worship. I invite you to follow me on my social media: Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and X. Sunday through Friday you'll find 2 daily questions posted at 2 p.m. and 8 p.m., designed to reinforce what we learn and open space for dialogue. Your comments always enrich our study. And don't forget to get ready for next week's lesson. Every new study is an opportunity to hear the voice of God and renew our hope in Him.